In light of everything that's happened over the last few months, how do we kickstart growth and momentum again? So just to get our heads in the zone as we start our time together, I want to kick off with a bit of an exercise. In a few moments, I'm going to put up on the screen here behind me a series of 9 brands. Now, these brands are in really different industries, very different businesses, but there are 3 things these brands all have in common. So look closely. I wonder if you can figure out what these 3 things are. I'll tell you what they are. Number 1, these are all brands that are big. They are all in the Fortune 500. Second thing is that these are all brands that are old. In fact, the youngest of these brands is 44 years of age. The oldest of the brands, you look at, say, General Motors, Converse, IBM, all over 110 years of age. Okay, but the third thing that each of these brands have in common, this might surprise you perhaps, is every one of these brands at some point in their existence has got to a point of crisis. So significant, it almost took them out of the game. And this happened at different points for different ones of these brands. For instance, for IBM it was 1992, for Apple and Marvel it was 1996, for Lego it was 2003. And regardless of what got them to this place of crisis, what we're going to focus on this morning is this question of what did they do afterwards? I often refer to these brands as the near-death 9. And while we can study what caused that crisis, we're going to look at this whole theme of how do you reboot and kickstart momentum after a crisis and learn from brands much like these. Now, this theme has been at the core of my research now for well over a decade. In fact, for 10 plus years, I've tracked a data set of 200 brands, organizations, and institutions right across the spectrum in an effort to understand the dynamics of what happens when disruption and crisis hits a business or an organization. Why is it, for instance, that when disruption hits, some businesses will take a hit, but then they recover, and often recover stronger as a result of the experience. And you see some of the competitors of those very brands that experience the same crisis, same disruption, and it completely wipes them out. What is the difference between those 2 experiences? And that's been the core of my research. What I want to do in these few minutes is try and distill some of the key lessons that the data is showing us, that the research is indicating around what it takes to actually rebound well from a time of disruption and crisis. And if you have something to write notes with, maybe grab it out because we'll move pretty quickly here. And there are 3 things that every brand or business that bounces back well does. Okay, the first is this. They think revolution, not evolution. And there's a subtle but significant difference between these 2 things. One of the most significant traps for any business or brand is when you get to the point where you start thinking about innovation and strategy from merely an evolutionary standpoint. Now, I love the insight from the former head of the business faculty at San Francisco University. Oren Harari was famous for saying, "Remember, the electric light never came from the continuous improvement of candles." Isn't that great? I love that because it is so fundamentally true. Like, it did not matter how good you got at making candles. There came a point where a fundamental rethink was required. And hey, if this crisis isn't the catalyst for thinking in a revolutionary way about what we do, how we do things, I don't know what will be. I mean, hey, we are all experiencing a revolution in this industry right now, the events industry, as we dial into this webcast. I mean, I think from my own perspective, if you told me in January this year that within 2 months I'd have like a fully functioning, soundproof, multi-camera broadcast studio in my basement at home, I would have told you you were absolutely mad. Okay, I had no particular interest in doing a whole lot of virtual keynote presenting, but hey, when this crisis hit, and necessity is the mother of invention for a good reason, and it became clear pretty quickly that was where the game was going to be at. I remember in early April when we sent our studio live for the first time for a client event, and it was sort of late night Sydney time, about 9:30 p.m. Sydney time, because the client was in London. And I remember as I switched all the cameras and lights off and walked back upstairs, I remember saying to my wife, I think I just witnessed a revolution in my industry. Because we'd had people from 52 different countries dialing into one presentation and no one left their homes. If we play our cards right, this crisis can be a huge opportunity for doing the very revolutionary rethinking we really probably should have been doing anyway along the line. Now, there's some great precedents for this, this revolutionary thinking in the face of crisis. One of my favorite examples of a brand that's done this very well over the years is the example of Amazon. Now, up on the screen behind me, you can see a fairly well-known, familiar graph. That is the graph of Amazon's share price over time. And hey, the meteoric rise of Amazon has been reported on ad nauseum in the business press. But what's interesting about this graph is this period of time right here. If you look at that up on the screen, that seems to be a time of just evolutionary change and incremental growth. But if you look more closely at this share price graph and just dial into that time frame, This is actually what it looks like. It was a pretty turbulent time. Of course, Amazon had their first heyday back in the late 90s. This was the time when Time magazine produced what I describe as the most creepy magazine cover they've ever produced when they named Jeff Bezos the Time Person of the Year in 1999. Now, within a few months, of course, everything changed. A crisis hit. That crisis was the dot-com crash. And what's interesting is to look at what Amazon did in the midst of that crisis. And there are some profound lessons in that time period. See, this time period here when things got dicey, when they lost in 14 months, 90% of their company value. That was a very acute crisis. And yet they did an uncommon thing in the face of crisis. Now, what do most businesses do in the face of a crisis like what we've just seen? We sort of think, okay, we're going to batten down the hatches. We've just got to get through. We've got to look for cost efficiency. We've just got to ride this out. Wait till things get back to normal. Not Amazon. I mean, this was the time period where they took some swings. They were revolutionary in some extraordinary ways. In fact, they sowed the seeds for the amazing company they are today in that crisis period. In fact, this is when they launched, for instance, the Amazon marketplace, which saw them shift from being a single seller online to being a platform player. And it shifted the entire notion of online commerce. This was when we saw the earliest stages of Amazon Web Services, again, something that became an industry-defining innovation. Now, the reality is some things they did in that time period didn't quite work the way they'd hoped. For instance, they placed a big bet in this time period that Segways were going to be the future of personal mobility. Didn't quite work that way. Remember the good old Segways, okay? And here's a key point, of course. Being revolutionary, it's risky, but it's necessary. And it is more necessary right now in this crisis than ever. And here's why. Over the last few months, we've talked a lot about how the world has slowed down as we've not been zipping around the world on flights and commuting to work, as James just talked about. But you know what hasn't slowed down in the last few months? The pace of disruptive change. Now, I spend a lot of my time in that sort of futurist camp, trying to identify what are the key nascent trends that are on the way that we've got to be focusing on closely. And I want to put it to you over the last few months as I've really identified some of those trends that were already on the radar before this crisis. What's been interesting to me is those trends have been accelerated massively by this crisis. In fact, there are 6 that if we had time, we could drill down and look at a whole lot more closely. The first of these that we've seen really accelerate over the last few months in the midst of this crisis is the influence of ubiquitous artificial intelligence, how we've seen machine learning infiltrate every conceivable area of life and commerce. And if you get a chance to listen to Katrina Wallace's session as part of this showcase, make sure you dial in to get a sense of just what's happened there over the last few months. You look at what's happened in the area of democratized distribution. I mean, this crisis has forced us to rethink manufacturing, supply chain management, inventory management. But what we've seen really come to the fore is the influence of things like 3D printing, the power and potential of that technology that will reshape the entire notion of manufacturing and supply chains. And we've seen a huge rethink in the way we work. And James, of course, touched on this before. And a lot of my time right now is working with clients who are trying to identify what does the future of work and the workplace actually look like. Number 4, the big one, of course, has been around automated mobility. We've talked a whole lot about driverless cars over the last few years, but if you've watched carefully in the last few months, this has really accelerated because the driverless car companies have pivoted their technology to focus on humanless or contactless delivery. And that is one to watch very closely in the next little while. We've seen digitized commerce accelerate as well. Of course, this crisis will be seen as the death knell of cash, physical cash, in every economy around the world. And this has huge impacts, not just for retailers, but also in the banking and financial services space. But the 6th and final key trend that's been accelerated by this crisis is something that's often referred to as the trust economy. Now, the theme of trust has been a key part of my research for the last 18 months leading up to this crisis. How do you build trust and brand equity in a time when the marketplace is far more skeptical, far more cynical than ever? And in a time of crisis, when things are uncertain, we crave trusted brands, organizations, individuals. And that leads us actually to the second thing that we need to do really well if we're going to bounce out of this crisis well. If the first is to be revolutionary, not evolutionary, the second key is to focus or think about principles, not profits. Now, of course, profits are important, but how do we be principle-led first? Now, over the last few months, you probably noticed, like I have, there have been plenty of motivational memes bounce around Facebook and Instagram, but one of them that really caught my attention in the early days of this crisis caught my attention because the source of this quote or this meme was a surprising one. This wasn't from Michelle Obama or Mother Teresa. This was a quote from someone who is best known in our household. My wife and I have a 4-year-old. So this guy's best known in our household as the voice of Diego, the saber-toothed tiger from the Ice Age movies. And if you know those movies well, you may well know that the voice of Diego, the saber-toothed tiger, is Dennis Leary. And in the opening days of this crisis, Dennis Leary shared a quote online that went viral almost immediately. And what he shared online was this: crisis doesn't create character, it simply reveals it. How true that is. And so what we're seeing right now in this crisis, and what we'll see in the months ahead, is it's going to show what businesses actually really stand for, not what they espouse as their values and priorities. And I think there's some great examples we've seen of this played out over the years. One of my favourites is the example of KFC. Now, KFC a few years ago in the UK faced a significant crisis. That crisis was that 80% of their stores ran out of chicken, which is not great when your name is KFC and the C stands for chicken. Okay, not great, okay? And you think about how many businesses would respond to this crisis. KFC did a superb job. In order to respond, the first thing they did is they went back to what are our values. For them, one of their core values is a consistent customer experience. So they made the audacious call, the decision to close all of their stores, even those that had stock, at great cost, because they thought if we can't be consistent in the customer experience, that to us is a non-negotiable. What I also love about what KFC did though is this. They also went back to first principles and said, how should we respond as a business? What's our personality? What's our voice? Let's be real. Let's be authentic in the face of this crisis. And let's just not have press releases and press conferences and promises of inquiries. Let's just be ourselves in response. And what I loved is that the response they had that was very, very much them as a brand. They took out 2 full-page advertisements in newspapers in the UK, and this was the ad they ran right here. Now, you probably can't read the text there, but basically what it says is this: you know what? We stuffed up. Sorry, we'll learn from it. They owned it. They were real. They were authentic. They were vulnerable. Now, if you look back, this crisis actually became a gift for KFC because it allowed them to show who they really were. It earned them massive trust, massive brand equity, brand affinity. And if we play our cards right in the coming months and years, that's the opportunity for all of us right now. How do we think principles, not just profits? Hey, profits matter. We've got to stay alive. Cash flow is going to be king, but principles have got to lead the way. Right, number 3, the third and final thing, if we're going to gear up well for bouncing back after this crisis, is we need to think momentum, not motivation. And momentum, not motivation. Now, motivation is going to be important, but I think we're going to spend so much time, if we're not careful, trying to just hype people up in organizations and realize that's not going to have the effect that we are looking for in terms of kickstarting growth after this crisis. Momentum is going to be where it's at. We'll talk in a few moments about why that's the case. But think about when you first learn about the whole dynamic of momentum. For many of us, we first learned about this back in high school science class. I want to take you back there for a moment. Let's play a quick game together. I'm going to call this game, Were You Paying Attention? Okay, I want to take you back to high school science. And I'm going to ask you a question in a few moments relating to something you learned in high school science. I wonder how many of you were actually paying attention. Okay, the question is this one here. What is Newton's first law of motion, also commonly known as? Okay, multiple choice, A, B, C, or D. Is it the law of inversion? Is it the law of immersion? Is it the law of inertia? Or is it the law of implosion? A, B, C, or D? Now, if you were paying attention, you would know, okay, that the correct answer is actually C, the law of inertia. We learnt this in high school science class. And what does the law of inertia tell us? It tells us that the hardest thing to do is get off go. Once you're in motion, it's much easier to speed up. It takes the greatest energy to get moving in the first place. And this is the key challenge for all of us now as we emerge from this crisis. It's going to take energy to get off go. So how do we do that well? Now, a few years ago, I wrote a book looking at this whole theme of how do businesses kickstart momentum again when they've lost it? If you've lost your mojo, how do you get it back? One of the key things that came through in that research was this. If you want to rebuild momentum, you need to think rhythm, not rate. Now, there's a difference between those two things. Many of us make the mistake of thinking to make a big impact in our businesses, we've got to do a big thing. And yet, interestingly, what the data shows us is that actually the thing that will make the biggest difference in kickstarting momentum is a cumulative effect of small things. And this is what we need to give our teams right now, a sense of momentum. quick wins, feeling like they're getting runs on the board. Why? Because, hey, success breeds success, but also these things restore confidence, hope. They remind people what it feels like to win, how important that is right now. Rather than just hyping people up, how do we give them a sense of progress? I love the insight from James Clear in his superb book, Atomic Habits. And James Clear said this: the most effective form of motivation is progress. How do we give people that sense of progress and momentum? That's where our energies have got to be focused if we're going to kickstart growth after this crisis. Now, we're almost out of time, but before we finish up, I want to be really honest. Let's acknowledge the fact that this crisis has been, it's been tough. It has been, I think of some of my clients, it has been for them not just confronting and unsettling, it's been utterly devastating. I don't want to make light of that. But the reality is this: we're at a point right now, this is the key point, as we exit this crisis around the world at various times and points. We're at the stage now where we get to choose what happens next. We can't change what's happened. We can't. We'd love to, but we can't. Right now, we get to write the story of what this crisis will mean when we look back on it in the years to come. And only you get to write that story. And as we finish, I wanted to leave you with a great quote from the late, great Andy Grove, the former head of Intel, when he said this. He said, some companies are destroyed by crisis. Others merely survive and they just get through. Great companies are always improved by a crisis. Right now we get to choose what the story will be post this crisis for us individually, but also for our organizations. Will you be someone who just gets through this crisis, or will you be someone or an organization that isn't just improved by it, but comes out of it stronger as a result of the experience? My deep hope is that some of what we've shared in the last few minutes will give you some tools to do just that. So thank you so much. All the very, very best. Cheers.